Counterpoints. With this double interview series, I wanted to do a pair of balanced, fair interviews probing the differing views within the U.S. government regarding the UFO-UAP phenomenon. In this interview, I'm joined by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, the recently retired former director of AARO, the U.S. government's all-domain Anomaly Resolution Office, tasked with trying to identify reports of UFOs, but also to look into the U.S. government's past involvement with UFOs and find out whether there ever really were retrievals. More importantly, I asked how those would be classified and a number of other questions, including about the Nimitz event that has made so many waves and a number of other things. So this serves to show the skeptical side of interpretations within the U.S. government, something of great interest during a time of continued congressional hearings trying to figure out just what's going on here, if anything. Along with the previous interview on the pro side, I leave it up to you, the audience, to decide.
You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. John is joined today by Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick is a laser and materials physicist and senior intelligence officer who served as the first director of the United States Department of Defense's All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO. He served in a variety of no-fail roles including Deputy Director of Intelligence, U.S. Strategic Command, Director, National Security Strategy, National Security Council, Deputy Director of Intelligence, and the DNI representative for U.S. Spacecom. He also served as Chief Scientist at DIA's Missile and Space Intelligence Center. He is the recipient of several scientific and military intelligence awards. These include the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, the Joint Meritus Civilian Service Award, the National Intelligence Exceptional Achievement Medal, 4 National Intelligence Collaboration Medallions, the NRO Innovation and Achievement Award, the Cleary Award for Scientific Excellence, and the DIA Director's Award for Excellence.
Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Doctor, the Fermi Paradox, and this gets into physics in general, the Fermi Paradox comes from Enrico Fermi back in the day, the 1950s, thinking about alien life over lunch and saying, well, where are they? We should be seeing them if they were common. What is your view, to sort of set the stage here, what is your view of alien life in the universe as a physicist? Do you think it's probably out there, or are you in the camp that, no, this is rare and that we shouldn't see it?
Okay, so the Fermi Paradox is fascinating in its simplistic approach to the universe. It's a very apt question. It's spawned lots of research. It's spawned lots of NASA programs. It's spawned lots of SETI programs. It's spawned lots of conjecture and a lot of scientific research. And coming out of that, as you all know, right, was the famous Drake equation, which calculates, at least at first order, the probability of intelligent life in the universe. And statistically, most of the scientific community would agree that, well, one, it is statistically improbable that there's not life in the universe outside of Earth, and that across all time that the universe has existed, it is statistically impractical to believe that there hasn't been other intelligent life out in the universe. But that conversation and that exploration of that question is scientifically grounded in a lot of the observations that NASA undertakes to probe the different types of planetary systems throughout the universe as far as we can see today, and how that factors into the calculations for the Drake equation. And just within our galaxy alone, the last couple of papers I looked at on this was, estimating based on current Webb telescope measurements, somewhere between 30 and 300 planets that can sustain life and may have some form of intelligence in it. That's across one galaxy. So as a scientist, it's just mathematically impractical to believe that there's not other intelligent life throughout the vastness of the universe. Where it becomes interesting is carrying that conversation closer to this solar system and closer to Earth, because those same statistics apply, and that the probability of there being an intelligent life form out in the universe that has found this particular solar system and this particular planet is just as rare as us finding them. So I can't see or fathom how that rationally translates to the underlying stories that pervade public perception today.
Well, there's a plausible way, at least. Now, space is vast, and crossing space is costly. You're going to need a lot of energy and a lot of time. And we're constricted by things like relativity and the speed of light and things like that really put a damper on the notion of traveling between star systems. But you can do it as long as you don't care about time and you've got the energy and you don't care about having any connection to where you left, your time, because everybody's going to be dead by the time you get back, unless they live for ridiculously long periods of time. But one plausible way, and I've talked to other physicists about this, is the idea of a von Neumann probe, where you have a machine, essentially a self-replicating machine that can populate a galaxy inside of a few million years at sublight speeds, at comfortable speeds. And a machine doesn't really care about the passage of time. So that is the one way that this could happen, where you could have an alien presence in most star systems. And let's face it, 3D printers exist, and something could be printing out UAP or atmospheric probes to look at the most interesting planet in this star system, presuming this one is the most interesting one. So there is a plausible way. Did you account for that in AARO? Did you think, well, maybe?
So when we set up AARO, one of the key tenets of setting up AARO and all the processes that I put in place to do so was to follow the data. It was to be open to all hypotheses of what could be possible, and then look at where the data led you. And none of the data supported that theory. So we did have a range of hypotheses. I had on one end of the spectrum, you have the alien hypothesis, whether it's probe or otherwise. On the other end of the spectrum, you have adversary technology, leap ahead technology that they are intentionally trying to hide from us. And then in the middle, you have really all the mundane known objects that just manifest themselves in weird ways because we haven't calibrated our sensors against those. And so what was established was a very rigorous scientific method for how do you test that range of hypotheses against all of the reported observations. Is that one, you had to start with all of those military sensors, all of those ground-based or air-based sensors, or even space-based sensors, need to be calibrated against known objects. Most of the reporting comes from military or intel, mostly military platforms and pilots. And what everyone needs to understand is those platforms are purpose-built. They are designed for one thing, and that is to identify large metallic types of objects coming at them and put a weapon on it. So if it's a missile or an aircraft or a ground system or whatever it might be, to identify those large, fast-moving objects and put a weapon on it. They are not designed to identify, for example, weather balloons or small drones or other types of objects that have been used for a variety of different purposes. And one of the things that one has to do when approaching the scientific method out in the world is start with calibrating all of your sensors and make sure you understand what those sensors would see. And so that was one piece, right? Set up the calibration program to identify those known objects. What do they look like in, for example, an F-35? What do they look like in an F-22? What do they look like in a ground radar? And catalog all that, understand what those characteristics are. Then you take the reported observations and any data that has been collected with that and compare to the known objects. That's sort of step one. The next two steps involve two different communities. So if you look at that range of hypotheses again, if I go to the end of the spectrum that could be adversary advanced technology, that is the purview of the intelligence community. And so I had chartered the intelligence community to go and look for what were some of the research programs that our adversaries were working on and what would happen if they had a breakthrough and that what we thought they were working towards in a decade, they were able to achieve today. And what would that look like? And what were those signatures? So then you'd have a body of knowledge that involved validated, here are the signatures and capabilities that the intelligence community assesses an adversary would manifest with. You have the measured signatures of all the known objects. And then your last bit is, okay, well, what would alien tech look like and how would it potentially manifest itself? And so that was part of the challenge to the scientific community through NASA of, all right, well, we know theoretically how interstellar travel works. While we may not have been able to achieve it from an engineering perspective, we know what the basic underlying physics are. We've seen lots of papers out in the literature about it. What does that look like? What kind of signatures would that manifest as? And then keep all of that as your measurement stick, right? And so when you get different reports and you get different data that we then had directed to the military and the IC, new reporting requirements to maintain and transmit all of that data, you can then have something to compare to. And as you go through that exercise, time and time again, it turns out to be in the middle. It turns out to be mostly the known things that you've characterized and compared to.
Was that frustrating, though, when dealing with that, with instrumentation that is not ideal for studying something other than a Chinese fighter jet? Was that frustrating in trying to resolve cases in AARO? In other words, did you wish you had more data?
Oh, absolutely. Always wish we had more data. And so part of what I had done was also design purpose-built monitoring sensors for areas that had high levels of reporting so that we could go out and do persistent surveillance and monitor on a continuing basis what was passing through the airspace and what characterize it as best we can, to augment the sensors that were not designed to do that. So, what I think a lot of folks fail to understand is that a U.S. aircraft, an F-35 or an F-22 or an F-414 or whatever it is that's flying around and collecting is not a scientific platform. It is not meant to collect and characterize unknown things. It is only meant to do one thing, and that is type a set of known objects, foreign adversary aircraft, missiles, what have you, and put a weapon on it, not characterize an unknown object. And so when it sees an unknown object, these advanced aircraft and these advanced platforms the algorithms try to make sense of it. And when they try to make sense of it, they make mistakes. The algorithms make mistakes. I mean, it's just like if you take an AI, you take a chat GPT and you give it bad data to train on, it's going to give you really weird answers when you talk to it. It's the same concept. It's just in a machine characterization language. And so, yes, it has been very frustrating because people will then pull on somebody saw X and the radar said this, and so therefore it must be an alien. I'm like, well, no, it doesn't, right? Because radars make mistakes when the algorithms don't understand what they're looking at. And a great example of that is how a radar operates. So a radar sends a series of pulses out to a target, and it looks for the reflections back. And from that, it classifies and characterizes speed and range. If that object is semi-transparent, like a translucent weather balloon that only has a few thick wires through it, those reflections they're not well defined. They're sporadic, and they tend to give a false range. They give a false speed because the algorithm is trying to fill in the gaps of the missing data. And we've shown this time and again in the lab and in the field where we did live characterization events and tried to get that into our quiver of how do we compare unknown objects to the sensors. Folks don't understand that, and they don't know that that's how these things operate, and they pull on this as it must be factual. So yes, that's a long way of saying it's very frustrating.
Now, biases, and in science you always want to try to remove biases or at least recognize them and your assumptions as well. But in this case, AARO wasn't making the assumption. You didn't go into this saying, well, it's not aliens. You went into it going with an open mind. Now, do you think that's a problem with NASA and technosignature searches? In other words, and you've said it, to paraphrase you, the orbit of Mars and views change the closer you get. So a technosignature out at Jupiter would be seen as one thing, or Oumuamua, you co-authored a paper on that's one thing. But the closer you get to Earth, the views begin to change and the profile changes. Now, I have a caveat here. The thing is, I can't tell you the difference between a von Neumann probe in the orbit of Jupiter versus one in the atmosphere. It's the same thing, functionally. So how do you rectify that? What's your view on that? Where does that bias come in, and what does it mean?
Yeah, so let me give you my actual characterization of the scientific discussion. And at some point, I think I want to turn it into a political cartoon of some sort of cartoon. So if I have this conversation about the search for extraterrestrial life, whether that's intelligent or a bacterium, and I'm doing it in the context of the scientific community and NASA's mission to find it, and as long as we're talking about it out in the universe, across the Milky Way, or even into the vastness of the universe with all the other galaxies that are there, then it's a very scientific, objective, data-driven, evidentiary-driven discussion and analysis. As I move that conversation closer to Earth, somewhere around, my conjecture is somewhere around Mars-ish, it becomes more science fiction, right? You're now there's an element of science fiction that creeps into the discussion. Any number of movies about this have happened. And then as I get that conversation closer to Earth, somewhere as I cross the ionosphere, it crosses into conspiracy theory. And clearly, the government's lying, and we've been hiding, alien tech that has crash landed 12 times in the United States, and we're hiding all that. So these are the kinds of things that make it very difficult to have a rational discussion about the evidence and about the data because of that transition from scientific to conspiracy. Now, that being said, how do you fix that? I think to your point, how do you get to this? How do you actually have this conversation? How do you distinguish between a technosignature of a probe at Jupiter versus, Earth? And the answer is, it comes back to the scientific community. And this was something I challenged them with very early on. And I was enlisting the help of NASA to help push that is, okay, it's a valid hypothesis. It could be a hypothesis. What is the data that supports that? And what would those signatures look like? What kind of propulsion would be evident? What kind of signatures would that propulsion give? What kind of refueling and energy harvesting would need to be done? Why would one put a probe here, right? And we can talk about that a little bit in the context of NASA sending probes out. Why would we do that? What would we be looking for? And put some peer-reviewed scientific papers into the domain that point to if there was a probe in Earth's atmosphere, how would it get here? What are the three most probable ways it would get here? What are the three most probable ways it would maneuver around the Earth? What are the three most probable ways it would harvest energy? And take all of that and figure out what the resulting signatures and indicators would be, and then marry that to the data that we have. And what you'll find is none of that matches. And so what you're left with is, okay, well, then that hypothesis, while it's still a valid hypothesis, has no data to support it as being the answer to what you're seeing. So people, when they don't get when the data doesn't support that hypothesis in the scientific community, that means that hypothesis is not correct, and that you have to change your hypothesis. It doesn't mean you have to change your data. In this particular topic area, for reasons that are fascinating from a psychological perspective, the human condition wants it to be an answer that data does not support. So scientifically, to answer your question, if I wanted to distinguish a probe in Jupiter or Earth, you still have the same signatures. Now it's a matter of, do any of the signatures you've measured, either in Earth or around Jupiter, match your hypothesis? Does that make sense?
It does. Now, I have to ask the point-blank question that I'm sure you get a lot. Just to clarify, did you find any evidence or see any evidence of a non-human intelligence present here? And I use that word very specifically because there's ideas floating around like the Silurian hypothesis, where it isn't aliens, but it's still weird, and things like that. Did you or did you not see any evidence or even something slightly that made you go,
No, I have. There was nothing in the I think by the time I retired, I think we were well over 1,300 cases or something like that. And none of them had anything that would give an indication of a non-human intelligence. Now, did we see things that were weird within some of the sensors that did produce data? Yes. Were any of those alien signatures? No. Could they have been adversary signatures? Could they have been commercial signatures? Sure. They could have been a number of other explanations that we uncovered. And I think that's the important part, right? Is, all right, let's say I have something that's unusual. If I can come up with 3 different explanations, one of them being, okay, it's an alien and we don't know anything about it. The second one being, okay, well, maybe it's this commercial product that this company is advancing and the U.S. government's not really paying attention to, and it just happens to be there and we see it. Or the third one being it's an adversary that's doing something that we didn't expect them to do, but there's evidence that they're doing that. Which one are you going to believe is more likely? Is it the alien, or is it the adversary, or is it the commercial? And you don't know right offhand, but logic would suggest that one of the more common and simple answers, like, I don't know, it's a commercial thing that's just out there and we can go find what it is, and here's what it is, and it could have been this, likely could have been that. Versus, that is Occam's razor, right? So that would suggest the more simple explanation is likely versus an alien. But then from a national security perspective, we have to investigate, and this is where the real rub is, and this is really what AARO is kind of focused on, is let's make sure that the adversary is not doing something. We need to make sure that the adversaries aren't jumping ahead in a technological advancement in, say, I don't know, propulsion or signature management that we weren't tracking, or else we were tracking, but they had a breakthrough that we didn't anticipate. Now something that was looked at as an evolutionary technology has suddenly become revolutionary because they had a leap ahead and they're employing it against us. Well, that would be bad, right? From a national security perspective, that's bad. That's called a it could be a technological surprise, and we don't want that, right? So you got to look at all aspects of this, and it becomes frustrating and even to the point of maddening of where some people come out on, well, it can't be that, it must be aliens. And there's no logical reason why one can make that leap. None at all, other than belief. And that's just frustrating.
Now, methodology, to get a little bit deeper into that with AARO, visual artifacts and compression in videos, not to frustrate you further and remind you of frustrating things, but how big of a problem was that when you're looking at something that just isn't there? It's an instrument error.
Yeah, that happens a lot, and a lot of folks don't understand. If you've not dealt with imagery or imagery intelligence for a large part of your career, you can't understand the types of weird artifacts that show up in advanced sensors that you just would think is something else. And there's an example that we put on AARO's website. It's one in which there's an apparent UAP that's leaving some sort of wake in the video. As you watch the video, it looks like an atmospheric wake behind it. Right? And at first, when you look at this, your gut reaction is, wow, that is really weird. That is so cool. That looks like what you might see in some sort of advanced propulsion system. And that must be, evidence of an advanced propulsion system that we don't understand. Well, when you peel that onion back, and by that what I mean is you have to go frame by frame and pixel by pixel with the raw data, not the compressed data. And what you'll find is that wake that you see in this video it's a shadow image of the object from the frame before, and that's an artifact of the signal processing that occurs frame by frame in this sensor. And so what you have to do in order to accurately analyze some of this data is you have to understand what sensor it came from, and B, you have to understand what kind of signal processing and algorithms are done on the platform. And the only way you can do that is you have to go to that particular program office that builds and integrates those sensors on our military platforms. And you get a surrogate sensor, or you get the software, or you get the underlying models that are used to validate the sensor performance, and you recreate what it saw. And you validate, okay, well, this is actually, not a real wake in the atmosphere. This is an artifact of the signal processing. And you can find these kinds of examples in a variety of sensors that actually show, like we had one in comparison for that particular example of a predator looking at a scene, and there were people walking across the scene, and the people were leaving shadow behind them that looked like a wake that was the cutout of the person. And so you see the same artifact in other imagery examples, and you really have to understand that, how those work and how that operates in order to draw a conclusion. And in that particular case, I believe that turned out to be another aircraft, and it was out of focus, and so it looks like a oblong cigar, and it's leaving a wake because it's the signal processing of the saturated areas of the scene. So it's a very complex analysis that has to be undertaken for every single one of these reports. And people get frustrated out in the world because they're like, well, why can't you do this faster? Because that's why. You have to pull apart every frame. You got to pull apart the sensor. You got to pull apart the the pixels. And you can't do that level of analysis with a compressed video off the internet because you lose all of that information. Compression, to put it onto the internet, gets rid of all of the valuable information of at the pixel level, of the metadata, of the information about the sensor, which you need an actual to do the analysis. So if you were to look at a compressed image of the same sort of weird artifact, without having any of that other information to do that analysis, your first response would be, hey, that's really weird. That looks like evidence of some sort of atmospheric effect, when in fact it's not.
Yeah, technology comes with its problems, and with our ever improving technology, it actually sometimes seems to get worse and new problems crop up. Now, one of the most famous cases regarding the military and UAP of recent years, 20 years, is the 2004 Nimitz case. And I know that you've said there was a sort of a lack of data, this distant from that 20 years again. But did you see anything, and I want to ask this a little bit differently than probably most people would ask you, did you see anything that indicated that it was our technology and the pilots simply didn't know about something that we had?
So that, obviously I get asked about that case a lot. I got asked about that case a lot in Congress. There are a number of challenges, and I'll get to the answer to your question. There's a number of challenges with that case. One is it's 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, there was no requirement to save all of the data. There was no requirement to process that data. There was no requirement to even report the incident. All of that we changed when we stood up AARO. And it's important to note that it took however many years that was, 16 years, 17, 18 years, when we stood up AARO from the Nimitz event, that's when we changed all of those policies and made it a requirement that you will report, and here's what you will report, and you will maintain all of that data, and you will transmit it to AARO and to the service for analysis. So there was no requirement to keep all of that. So when people question, well, why is there no data? Well, it's not a big conspiracy. It's a logistics issue, right? These platforms don't save the data. They have a single recording device that is overwritten every mission. So there's no data off of those platforms. Now, there's allegations that, hey, there was a Aegis around and it collected data, and why don't we have that data? Well, it's a similar argument. There's no requirement for that. We don't have the Aegis data for every mission that was ever flown, including every training exercise, which this was. And you're training in a range that is a test range. So let's walk into answering your question. I spent a good amount of time talking with one of the pilots to get some descriptions of, what exactly was being seen and how was it being seen, so that we could get a little bit better understanding of some of the signatures associated with it. For example, was this something that may have come out of the water versus going into the water? And if it came out of the water, and what does it look like? What did it look like as you were flying? What speeds, what angles, and so forth. It's interesting to note that there are several programs, both U.S. and foreign, that could explain that, especially if you're in an experimental test range where one side of the range doesn't know what the other side of the range is doing, if you're thinking it's a U.S. technology. And if it's an adversary, well, they want to know what we're doing in our test range. There are some ways to do that. So let me give you an example. There was a declassified CIA program back in that time frame where they would launch their balloons with retroreflectors inside of them from the water to monitor what responses would be from ground radars and aircraft responses What would they see and how would they respond? Why would we think we're the only ones that thought of that, right? So I'm not saying that I have data to support that that is exactly what it was, but that is certainly a more logical explanation than it was aliens. And the problem is I can come up with a couple of hypotheses for what that was, but we don't have any data to analyze. So you're never going to answer that question, right? We're just not going to be able to answer what that was because there is no data.
I am glad that I don't work for the U.S. government, because that just got me thinking. When I was growing up, my dad was a field test engineer and worked at the Nevada test site, which is enormous. And I could just imagine how many different tests are going on. And the person that knows about all of the tests happening at the same time and has all the details, which probably is very few people do, imagine coordinating that to make sure your F-117 doesn't hit a weather balloon or something like that. It's got to be maddening, wouldn't you think?
Exactly. That's that kind of deconfliction is what test range managers are supposed to be doing. And there's no, if a test squadron on one end of the range happens to see a classified program on another end of the range, mitigation of that can range from ignoring it and pretending it never happened to, bringing the people in and making them sign inadvertent disclosure agreements, which is essentially an NDA that says, hey, you saw a classified program you weren't supposed to see and you're not briefed to and you're not allowed to talk about it. That is a standard practice of inadvertent disclosures across the classified community, whether it's DoD or IC or anybody. So there's no hard evidence one way or the other. So we could come up with all kinds of these scenarios and explanations and hypotheses, but unless I have data, there's not a lot to be done about that.
Yeah, no data, then might as well be confetti, unfortunately,
Right.
And I think everybody wishes there were more data, but again, I have to hammer home the point that you're dealing with sensors, or we're dealing with sensors, that weren't designed to look for UAP. They were designed to look for Russian and Chinese aircraft.
That's right.
However, we do have some interesting wildcards, and that is the NRO. Now, there was a Freedom of Information Act release that they had seen something that looked like a Tic Tac from orbit. And I was wondering, did you look into that? Are you aware of it? And were you able to do anything with that satellite data?
Yeah, so there were a couple of those reports, and we actually, worked with them very closely to do some research into historical imagery and forward imagery and even trying to get tasking in real time to when an event may have been seen. And all of those turned out to be weather balloons, radiosondes, and in one instance, it was another sensor anomaly on basically cosmic ray in the sensor. So, without getting into details about NRO's business, because that's obviously all very classified, yes, we did look into a number of these things. None of them turned out to be Tic Tacs in the popular sense. They turned out to be, aerostats or weather balloons or radiosondes.
I guess that's probably going to be pretty crazy too, is because anybody can launch a balloon, right?
Yep.
Anybody, and obviously drones, but there's limits on that. But the balloons, I don't think there are much limits, and any private individual or group, say you like to study clouds or whatever, that's your hobby, can launch a balloon. So there's stuff all over. But does that worry you? And then I got another question related to this. But does that worry you about aviation safety, that these balloons are going unchecked?
Oh, yeah. So that was one of the primary drivers for why the department agreed to stand up AARO was safety of flight issues, not just for the military, but for FAA and NASA and everybody else associated with it. So there's a couple of key things to understand that we learned as we were standing all this up. There is an international community of professional balloon, civil scientific balloon organizations, and they they have agreed amongst themselves, and I think there's some sort of agreement that underlies this, to put essentially beacons on their balloons, and they launch them, and you can track them in real time. In fact, we put the website links on AARO's website. If you go there and you look under the resources, you can go and look up, here's all the balloons that are registered with this community. Here are the beacons. Here's where they are today. Here's what country owns them. And then there's a hobbyist community that has done the same thing. So there's another website that you can track hobbyist balloons, and you can watch them and see where they are. So on one sense, you have a database of overt, legitimate balloon payloads and operators around the world in real time. So you should be able to deconflict with those. It's the ones that don't have those beacons or are flying in the airspaces they're not supposed to be that you got to worry about. And so part of what we established were rules for how to deconflict that and get that out with the operators in all of the airspaces to go, hey, if you see something, first thing you need to do is deconflict with these two websites, and let's make sure that those are not what you're seeing. And then there's a third place, and that's NOAA. NOAA and NASA have a database as well. It's not quite as user-friendly as the two websites, but it is complete and tracks everything that is registered with a beacon on it. So you can think of these beacons much like aircraft AIS systems, and they beacon out, here's who I am, and here's where I am, and here's where I'm going, and you can follow them around. But it does still worry everyone, and it worries me that these balloons don't, while they're beaconed and they're tracked and they're there's not a lot of coordination between that community and, say, the test ranges or the military or even the FAA on knowing what to do with that, because many of them are at of course, the mercy of the winds and the climate. Some of them have the ability to maneuver, limited though it may be, but they can. So how do you integrate that airspace in a safe manner and alert the pilots and the operators that what you're seeing is this balloon from a group in Japan or Norway or US, and you need to avoid it, but there's a lot of them out there. I mean, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of these balloons that are launched daily and are tracked all over the world. It's just phenomenal to me that we've got that kind of a air domain congestion problem that is increasing, and we haven't quite figured out how to deconflict. And instead, people come upon these things and don't know what they are because they're flying really fast by them, and it causes challenges, it causes problems, because if you run into one of those things, especially one that's got a payload hanging off the bottom, that's going to rip a wing off if you're flying at Mach 1 in a jet and you happen to run into a balloon with a payload hanging off the end. That's probably not a good day for that pilot.
No, that is scary. I've thought about that. That at high speed, you're in an F-22 or something like that, hitting one of these balloons, and like you say, a payload, not good. It seems like an accident waiting to happen. Now, All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO, all domain. What are the submarines seeing? Because I know that the hydrophone network has picked up some strange sounds that took 20, 30 years to come up with a hypothesis as to what they were, which is usually ice, moving in Antarctica, things like that.
Yep.
What are they seeing, and is that a lot harder to deal with than things in the air?
Oh, absolutely. So the maritime domain, integrating the maritime and the space domain was something I had started last, I guess, the summer a year ago. Space is actually, I think, an easier step than the maritime domain, because in the maritime domain, undersea is noisy. And not only is it noisy, but everything is anomalous, because there are so many unknown noises that crop up that people have to try to sort out. I had one report that turned out to be, some guy scraping barnacles off of his boat with a new type of scraper 2 bays away from where the sound was picked up. But it took 6 months to figure that out. I mean, these are not trivial events. And they haven't, in the maritime domain, at least by the time I retired, we hadn't come up with a good way of distinguishing, all right, when you hear something, what are the characteristics that would cause you to claim that is an anomalous technological thing that we need to go investigate versus, it's a underwater volcano, or it's a whale, or it's a school fish, or whatever the things are that while we may know what those sound like, again, I go back to the way the architectures are set up. A lot of this is automatic. You record some noise, and the algorithms don't know what it is, and so they put it off to the side for somebody to listen to and then analyze. Well, okay, how many of those do we get? And there's a lot of unknown there. So we didn't have a lot of, to answer your question more directly, we did not have a lot of undersea reporting because of that very fact, because everything is anomalous and nobody knows, well, what qualifies as something we would report. That's just not there yet. Now in space, it's a little easier. We have a good track of everything that's in space, and we have a catalog that monitors this, and we have objects that show up that are designated UCTs, right? So they're uncorrelated tracks. That's what that stands for. And basically, it's an object that shows up. Could be a micrometeorite. It could be a screw that fell off of somebody's satellite. It could be anything. And it gets us a couple of returns off of one of the radars, and now we've got a track, and well, what is it? And now you've got to figure out what that is. Well, I hate to tell you this, but space congestion is a really, really bad problem. And when we turned on Space Fence, I want to say, if I remember correctly, we had the number of UCTs went to 40,000-ish, and it was a daily deluge of thousands of objects that nobody knows really what they are. But the good news is they all obey Keplerian physics, right? So if it's not obeying Keplerian physics, well, that would be anomalous, and that would be easy to pick out and report. And no, there were none of those. But trying to work through what's going to be the reporting process, and how do we build that into the sensors and the algorithms so that you can pull those kinds of things out? That takes time, but there was a good path forward on how to do that. So I think that one is more achievable than the undersea one at this point.
Yeah, but the thing is that problem is going to get worse, space.
Oh, yeah.
With the amount of launching. I mean, just look at Starlink, speaking of something that could be mistaken for a UAP.
Yeah.
It's just astounding. Thousands, tens of thousands of satellites and constellations, all full of parts that can
and
get
Starlink
lost.
is a great example of, we had multiple reports of UAP and multiple UAP, some of them from very reputable groups, right? And whether it was special forces or radars or what have you, that it was it would be a Starlink launch that was letting loose a string of 20 to 60 satellites. Well, if you look at a string of 20 to 60 satellites being ejected from a launch, through, say, an infrared system or a radar system, that looks really weird. And unless you know that that's a Starlink launch, you're going to report it as a weird UAP thing because that's what everybody was doing. So we had lots of that, lots of UAPs that turned out to be Starlinks that we had to go back and correlate to a Starlink launch and correlate to the trajectory of the satellites. And yes, that was just Starlink.
Now, you had a slide, and I believe you showed it at your NASA presentation. You had a slide about UAP reporting trends, and it had some interesting stuff hidden in there. One was radio emission section that said 1 to 3 gigahertz and then 8 to 12 gigahertz. How did you arrive at those radio frequencies as being associated with UAP?
So let me be clear about what that section of that chart said. If you look at the top of that, it should say reported UAP or something to that effect. That set of characteristics that we put in there, it was taken from all of the various reports at that time. We've had reports about, they're spherical. We've had reports about there being possible radio frequencies that might be correlated with it, and those were the radio frequencies that were reported. We never measured those radio frequencies, but there were, some, like I want to say it was 1 or 2 reports that said that those were potentially correlated with the observation of a UAP. Now, what's important is it just so happens that 1 to 3 gigahertz is also Wi-Fi, and the 8 to 10 is near one of the X-band radars. So there are other potential explanations for what those radio frequencies were, but that was what was reported, and we were trying to capture in that chart. Here's kind of everything we're looking for, and how we're trying to go about doing that is, all right, we're going to put some sensors out to measure those frequencies, and we're going to look at, can I correlate that with any observations of UAP? And we did not. We found none of that.
Now, the other part of it that I found interesting was stationary to Mach 2. Did you ever see anything anomalous that was going Mach 2? Because a balloon is not going to do that. Or was that just under that same categorization that you're like, well, this is what we should look for at these speeds, but why not faster?
No, that was what was reported. The high end of that range came from a report from a radar that seemed to indicate that an object was going from roughly, I want to say it was around 0.4 Mach up to, not quite 2, but 1.5 Mach or something like that, and then dropping back down. And what we think that actually turned out to be was this phenomena with the radar where the pulses were not all returned, and the onboard algorithm, which was trying to calculate range and speed, was filling in the gaps with the missing data. And that essentially made it calculate this very rapid acceleration. So we think that particular case was essentially a radar artifact. But again, all of those parameters are things that had been reported. And so we wanted to capture all of that as a holistic, here is the entirety of what's been reported. And we're going to be investigating each of those. And we're going to see if we can measure anything in a more controlled fashion with better fidelity that would substantiate any of those characteristics that were reported.
Other countries. Now, we're not the only country in the world, and other countries have looked into UAP. In fact, France has looked into it for decades through their GAIPAN program, and they've correlated all kinds of stuff. And there was even a semi-official report that concluded that aliens were the best option. Was there any international coordination between AARO and other countries regarding what they see with UAP, and in particular France, because a lot of people associate UAP with nuclear energy, and France is the only other country that operates a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Did you ever call the French and ask them, what do you guys see?
Yeah, we had coordinated with a number of countries, and we were trying to get kind of a level set of what does each country actually see, what do they have data to support, and what kind of framework are they putting in place, if any, to do the same sort of measurement and analysis that we were. And most all of them, in fact, all of them came back with, we don't actually have any substantiating data. We, however, like your framework, and we would like to leverage your framework on how we're going to go about collecting and analyzing this. And we'd like to share data and see if we can try to get to the bottom of some of these things. Now, they put into place, to my knowledge, many of the same reporting requirements and data requirements, but they haven't gotten anything, and they certainly hadn't provided anything to us by the time I retired.
Now, moving further, instrumentation mounted on military assets. Now, you've touched on this a little bit, but let's go into it deeper. The idea of classification, and you've said this many times, is not because of what you're seeing. A bird isn't classified. The instrument is, and you can't tell other nation states your capabilities, and you want to keep that as secret as possible. But can you go out and take, off-the-shelf stuff, sort of like what the Galileo project is doing, and create an experiment to watch and then mount it on an aircraft carrier in a way that doesn't show anything sensitive, and do a data set like that? Will AARO try to proactively collect data on UAP from military assets?
So that was the plan. I'd have to refer you back to them to see how far they've gotten down that roadmap. But let's talk about the classification of data for a minute, because that's an important aspect that keeps coming up. So there are two ways data gets classified, right? I can have a classified sensor that has state-of-the-art technology. I don't want my adversary to know what my sensor can do, because if the adversary knows what my sensor can do, then they can defeat it, or they can spoof it, or they can jam it, or they can do whatever. But if I have a great sensor and it's on a platform, and it takes a picture of a Coke can, that picture is classified, because if I release that picture as it is, then somebody can take that picture and reverse engineer the picture and figure out what the sensor can do. And then you've given away a susceptibility of the sensor. That doesn't mean that the Coke can is classified. It just means that the image is, because of that. So to declassify that takes time, because the owner of the sensor and the platform has to do a couple of things. One, they have to scrub the data down to remove anything that could be exploited by an adversary. And that can mean everything from reducing resolution to scrubbing all of the metadata and all the things off of that. And then they have to evaluate it based on where it was taken, because if it was taken during a sensitive operation, you don't want to give away details about the operation. And so, the owner operator has to sign off on that. All of that takes time, and the time that it takes is directly proportional to the priority of said thing. And so, for example, there was the incident last year, I think it was last year sometime, where the Russians, flew at the Predator, and we had the video. We got the video declassified within, I want to say it was like 36 hours and sent out. Well, that's because there was a high priority with international relations with Russia, and the White House was very interested in making sure we got that out. So under that kind of pressure, that declassification is going to happen very quickly. Now, there's a whole other way that a set of data can become classified, and this gets to commercial technology or scientific technology that doesn't, the sensor isn't classified. But if I take a camera and I go out and I take the picture of the back end of the new B-21, that's classified because we're hiding certain characteristics of the platform, even though the sensor wasn't. So you have to balance and you have to understand what is being collected. So one of the issues is not imagery, but actual signals. So what signals are being collected off of, say, military comm systems or radar systems or platforms that you don't want others to know about, because then that gives them access to command and control and how the sensor RF might operate, and that's just as vulnerable as the imagery aspect of it. So there's a wide range of things that affect classification, but the collection of a UAP is not classified unless it comes from a classified sensor that we have to then have declassified, unless it's being taken in front of a new stealthy platform that we don't want anybody to know about. So those are the kinds of things that affect classification and how fast you can get it declassified.
Now, what of agencies within the Pentagon that have a different classification system, lesser perhaps, or classified for completely different reasons? And I would implicate the Coast Guard here because they do similar things to the Navy. The Navy sees UAP. What does the Coast Guard see, and is that less classified?
So if the Coast Guard saw anything, unless they're using a special sensor to collect it, it shouldn't be classified. But the Coast Guard didn't give us any reports of anything.
So nothing from the Coast Guard. That's interesting.
Nope.
For comparison reasons, with the Navy.
Yeah.
But different instruments. They're working with a completely different set of
That's right.
Coast Guard.
Completely different.
Yeah, a Coast Guard cutter is going to have a lot of different equipment related to law enforcement more than military.
That's right.
At least in peacetime, anyway. Now, as the director of AARO, now former director, had you found something in the halls of government, let's say a frozen alien body sitting at an Air Force base or something like that, Area 51 or whatever, how would you have handled that, and would you have disclosed it? I mean, what would you do if you had found something? And then a future director of AARO, what if they find something hidden and they're like, how do I release this, or do I?
So nothing would have made me happier than to be able to actually find aliens, but I didn't. So I've actually had this conversation with multiple folks in leadership, both my previous boss, the deputy secretary, and the undersecretary, INS. And the question was just that, right? If we find something, or we measure something, or we collect on something, what classification is it? What should it be? Is it even classified? And the answer that I think we all settled on was the discovery of extraterrestrial life is not a Department of Defense or IC mission. It is NASA's mission. And so if we had found anything to that sort, it would have been turned over to NASA for disclosure and announcement and analysis.
Yes, but what if it was technologically advantageous? Say you get a piece of a UFO that's very, very high technology that we could back engineer and use. I don't know that you would hand that over to NASA, so how would you classify that?
I don't know that anyone would actually do. So they might keep the technology to try and understand how to use it, but the existence thereof would still be turned over to NASA.
So openness. Were you happy with the openness that you got within investigating branches of the government and asking around? Did you run into anything where you're like, well, this person's being evasive or anything like that? And the thing is that, you can't read a person into every program, every SAP or everything, because that's dangerous. You don't want somebody knowing too much. So were you happy with the openness, or did you ever hit any brick walls? Now, people sometimes speak about that hitting brick walls in government, like the Department of Energy, perhaps. Did you run into any of that?
No. In fact, everybody across multiple departments, Homeland Security, DOE, DOD, IC, everybody, NASA, everybody was fully open and transparent because they wanted to put data to this problem. They wanted to address this problem because, frankly, they wanted to stop having to answer the questions. They wanted to move on with the missions that were really important to them. I don't know, like a couple of world wars and some conflicts and maybe going back to the moon and things of that nature. So I never ran into any hesitation. I was given access across the board on everything that we needed, everything that we came across. If I came across something that I didn't already have access to, I would get access to it. And then we analyzed and assessed everything. And it's fascinating to me how folks try to hide behind that. And I don't know how many ways I can say this clearly. Every program that people named as being potentially part of this conspiracy, we had full access to hold the programs out of the archives in many instances, got exactly what they were. And when I wrote up the final assessment, there was a very classified version that had all of those programs that were identified in there and what they actually were and what the conspiracy theorists were claiming they were. And that is with the congressional leadership and with the department leadership and with the IC leadership. So, yeah. And so going in the future, that will continue. The next director will finish that analysis with the next set of data that had come in as I was retiring. We had reviewed all of those programs. Same thing. Nothing extraterrestrial there, but fascinating nonetheless.
Do you think the government sometimes shoots itself in the foot, however, and creates mistrust? And we have to point out during the Cold War, all sorts of weird things happened, things like, for example, the Church Committee uncovering hidden documents that were stuck in a warehouse where a bunch of them had been destroyed by, I believe, the CIA, or testing radiation patterns by dumping radioactive materials off buildings in St. Louis, giving people syphilis, all of that. The government has a terrible track record from that period for openness and transparency and not sticking to government, stuff that, ethical stuff that it should. I'm not saying that this is going on now, but it did happen. Could it be that during that period, the U.S. government was perpetuating an alien origin hypothesis for UAP in order to hide the very programs that you looked into that people are associating with UFOs? Yeah,
that is a very plausible hypothesis. And yes, the government tends to shoot itself in the foot often. I think one of my windmills that I tilt at is the lack of really communication and not transparency, but a lack of communication in what they're finding and how it was found to try to mitigate some of the narrative and get control of the narrative that's out there. Certainly that is a possibility. What we found, and I think, again, what is important to understand from a historical perspective is there was no organized Pentagon level concerted effort to perpetrate such a cover story, if you will. There is some anecdotal evidence of local officers or local commands jumping on that bandwagon in order to hide programs because that was an easy cover story and it was fun to do. But it's come back, I think, to really bite them. And now that you've got to be able to demonstrate that through data, documents, and people who can attest to it. And that's going to take time and investigation. And a lot of it, I'm sure, is going to be protected under the Whistleblower Protection Act that everybody pushed to get forward. And well, it protects both ways, right? So anybody that comes forward to talk about their knowledge of that kind of a cover-up is also protected. So it's going to be hard to untangle a lot of that.
Do you think it's possible in your position, which, everybody knew what you were doing and you were appointed to it and doing it, do you think it's possible that you were misled by anybody in the contractor system particularly? Do you think that, was there any indication that you thought, well, maybe I could be misled here?
No, I had no indication of that. A lot of these folks, especially in the contractor communities, I've known for many, many, many years, had working relationships with. They bent over backwards to try to not only help me find records or evidence, but also people who had knowledge, kind of firsthand knowledge of story origins and what was actually happening at the time that a particular event was said to have occurred, and got them to come in to talk to us so that we could document all of that and write it down and investigate it and cross-reference it with. So we actually untangled quite a bit of one of the allegations for a contractor, hiding this technology, and where that actually came from and how it was linked to some of these other stories that don't have any validity as either. So it's an interesting way that the story is propagated, but from a misled perspective, no, I had no indication that I was being misled by anyone other than some of the whistleblowers that were coming in.
Now, there is something burning the internet down, and it's another FOIA thing, talking about recovery and materials transfer in a document. What did that mean? What is the story behind that document?
Yeah, okay, so AARO is congressionally directed to come up with not just standard reporting procedures, but also mitigation and response procedures for in the event of a shoot down or a collection of any sort of UAP, keeping in mind that UAP involves everything from balloons to drones to alleged alien tech. And so to do that, mitigation and response, as well as standardized reporting, will occur through all of the combatant commands. And so that particular meeting was to go meet with the J3, who's in charge of operations, to start the discussion on how we're going to define those procedures and whether or not we have to provide a flyaway team in the event of any sort of shoot down to collect whatever is there, because by law, Congress told AARO it had to come up with mitigation and response procedures, as well as develop, flyaway teams or whatnot to go and collect anything that had to be done. The problem is those types of activities are already covered under foreign material collection and analysis. So there's already a process and procedures in place for many of these things. And so this conversation was really to start, how do we document that for UAP, and what kind of procedures do we need to put in place, and what kind of processes do we need to put in place? And I started with Space Command because that's where I came from. And that was a kind of an easy way to get this started to address congressional concerns. So there wasn't an actual thing. It was hey, we need to go have a conversation about how we're going to do this and get the teams started in documenting that. That goes into the J3, which is the Director of Operations, operational procedures and processes.
So you literally created a UFO recovery team, in short, in the event something like that were to happen.
It's any UAP recovery, and it was really more the process and procedure, because they already have people in place that would collect. Like if we shot down another Chinese high altitude balloon, it's that team that would go and collect it, right? It's those procedures and processes on how it gets notified and how we go and get it. And that would be now true for pretty much anything.
Does the government have an Indiana Jones warehouse where they have all of these foreign materials, Russian, Soviet, materials from the Cold War, planes and things like that they recovered, parts of missiles and everything else, that are archived somewhere and still kept secret because it's sensitive, because of foreign relations?
I wish we had a big old warehouse like that, but that would be fun. But we do, the IC and the DoD collects foreign material and they exploit it, just like foreign adversaries collect on us and exploit it. And so some of that stuff is stored in places.
I had to ask a question because obviously it's burning the internet down. So, all right, aliens. I got 2 more questions for you, and this one's just aliens in general. Is that treated as a national security concern? In other words, say you had found something, wouldn't that be really scary to have an alien civilization, a presence here of very highly advanced nature, far beyond anything we can do? Does the government say that's a national security threat? In other words, would that have been a high priority? We need to build some missiles or something like that. Or do they just assume they'd have done something by now if they were here?
No, this will be a wholly unsatisfying answer. But when we had this conversation about if we actually found anything, what would the classification be and how would we handle it? Most of that, apart from the part of we're going to get NASA will take lead, but it's also going to be it's got to go up to the president for a decision on is it a national security issue or is it a humanity civilization issue? And so that's, I think, what would actually happen is it would get briefed over, probably in partnership with the department by NASA up to the president for a decision.
Yeah, I know certain presidents have thought about it because I believe Ronald Reagan asked Gorbachev if the Soviets would help us if there was an alien threat, and Gorbachev said yes. But again, that's presidential level. Now, my last question, and this is a fun one. In looking into all of these programs and past programs and finding not evidence of aliens, but did you find weird historical stuff that's eventually going to come out about programs that we did that's just really cool? In other words, we really did make this kind of a plane or something like that, and it's just not out there yet. Was there anything that you thought, wow, that's amazing?
Well, obviously, I would have to say I am very impressed and deeply proud of both the DoD and the IC's capabilities that they are developing and building to protect this nation. And I think everybody should take some solace in that. There are some really, really great technologies that are coming. Really great.
I am hoping for fusion energy.
Well,
all right.
Everybody's hoping for that.
Everybody's hoping. Well, imagine if you had, I remember Lockheed was developing trying to develop a compact fusion reactor that could be launched into space that was the size of a truck. And I'm like, man, if we had that and we had fusion energy in space, it's Battlestar Galactica,
Oh, yeah. That'd be awesome.
It would be. All right, Dr. Kirkpatrick. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there's a fusion energy conference coming up here at the end of next month, I think, where we'll talk about the state of the art of the fusion community. I think that would be a fascinating thing to listen to.
Oh, absolutely. All right, Dr. Kirkpatrick, thank you for joining us and giving me so much time. And good luck in your endeavors from now on. And I will continue to watch AARO under the new director and see what they find or don't find.
All right. Or not find, yes. All right, well, I appreciate it. Thanks very much. Let me know if there's anything else you need.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice.